Sister Lyora pushed the heavy folio, and the leather strap snapped free with a wet slither. Ink bled along the torn edge, and the script dissolved under her fingertips. Corin, look, it's disappearing, and Lyora's hand moved to steady the folio while her other hand pressed a linen cloth against letters that were vanishing. Suspicion tightened her throat. She counted that tightening as a warning.
I remember.
She forced her breath to the rhythm she used when transcribing ritual sessions and leaned closer until the candle flame threw a bright line across the page. Corin's knuckles tapped the ledger's oak board twice, faster than his usual habit. The hook was immediate. Names removed where they had been written minutes before. The problem was visible and urgent. The order did not lose pages by accident. Lyora had been a scribe for 20 years. She knew parchment grain ink composition and the tiny tells of forgery. She also knew the order's rules about sealed folios and custody. Within 5 sentences the stakes were clear to her. An authorized erasure might protect the city, but an unauthorized one could be a crime that eliminated people from record. Lyora felt suspicion first and then translated it into action. She wrapped the folio in her ink-proof sleeve, pinched the parchment where the script had gone pale, and said, "Corin, fetch Marek quietly." Her voice was soft and precise. The first shift arrived as she ordered the summons. Suspicion guarded determination. Corin moved like a man who wanted the answer faster than caution Marek. At this hour, he asked. He spoke with the young edge in his voice that Lyora had seen when his experiments went too far. Corin's fingers brushed the memory thread bracelet at his wrist. Lyora watched the thread tighten under his palm. Yes. Now, bring only the lantern. He hesitated and then left, throwing a glance at the stacks as if the shelves might have heard them. The archive smelled of beeswax and old glue. Lyora's hands still had ink at the tips. She wiped them on her habit and set the folio on an oak lectern so Marek would see the damage without touching it first. She watched him approach with that flat, slow step he always used to make his authority feel absolute. Marek removed his spectacles and leaned until the light cut across his nose. He tapped the page once with the tip of his ring and said, "This is a memory-marked sheet." Someone used an unregistered seal. Lyora's second emotion shift arrived then, guarded determination prickling doubt about procedure. Marek kept his face composed. He always kept his face composed. Lyora recorded his words in her margins while he explained the order's sanctioned methods for regulated forgetting. Brass seals stamped to isolate names, ink dissolved by compound vapors, witness neutralization through mnemonic chords. He described process in technical terms. Lyora wrote the steps down with quick strokes. Corin interrupted with a question about regents. Marek answered with the same calm register and a small, clinical smile. Lyora felt doubt like a taste on the tongue. Marek's tone said containment. His silence said he had the authority to decide which memories should vanish. They argued about custody as they always did. Warden Edda arrived before the end of Marek's explanation. Her boots made no sound on the stone, but she filled the doorway instantly. She took the folio with one gloved hand and checked the strap with the other. "This is a ritual matter," she said. "I will secure it." Marek did not step back, not without documentation. "Edda, you know the process." Edda's jaw set. In 3 short lines the dispute hardened. Edda ordered custody. Marek demanded procedure. Lyora watched both of them pull authority toward their own ends. The tension widened. Corin spoke faster. "Edda, if you seal it without a witness, we want to know what was removed." Edda looked at Corin and then at Marek. "Or we will prevent harm," she said. Marek's hand brushed his signet ring. "You would destroy evidence," he answered. The exchange ran 3 more times, quick and clipped, then stalled on a decision point. Lyora kept her hands on the lectern. She catalogued the way both of them moved. Marek's measured gestures, Edda's decisive reach, Corin's restless shifting. Each motion told her who would press the ledger toward secrecy and who would press it toward record. They moved the folio to Marek's study. Lyora followed, carrying her field journal. The study smelled of iron keys and concentrated dust. Marek set the folio on a table beneath a single lamp. "We will treat this as a controlled test." He instructed Corin to assemble a brass memory, Mark and for Lyora to transcribe every step. Lyora accepted the role without argument because transcribing was what she did. It was how she resisted erasure. The third emotion, shift, came as she agreed. Doubt, tense vigilance. In the laboratory, Corin arranged reagents on a slate counter. A lamp made halos on the brass. Lyra wrote while Corin measured acid tinctures and burnt resin. Merrick watched them both with the same flat attention he always carried. Corin's hands trembled when he held the brass memory, mark up to the light. "I don't want to do this alone," he said. Lyora never had to ask who he meant. "You want to be alone," she answered. Her words were short and practical. She added the time, the exact angle at which Corin placed the seal, and the smell when resin burned, a citrus tang with wet, earth undernote. The experiment began with procedure and ended with result. Selective suppression across witnesses. They tested the mark on a single name written on a slip. Corin pressed the brass ring down and Marek intoned the words of neutralization in a voice that had the same dryness as his notes. The slip's ink paled within seconds. Lyora recorded the cadence of Marek's syllables and the exact pause between them. She described Corin's breathing. After the test, Corin read the slip aloud and then looked blankly at the table. He could not remember that he had written the name 10 minutes earlier. He touched his forehead with the heel of his hand. "I remember doing it," he said, "but I don't recall the name." His voice caught. The chapter's pressure increased. Lyora felt a concrete reaction. Her fingers tightened on the quill. Back in the cataloging alcove at dawn, Lyora began the ledger inventory. She moved books, recorded dates, and checked seals. At first the ledger behaved, ink clung, dates held. Then an entry mid, list softened and faded while she catalogued it. She leaned forward. The page showed the start of a name, and then bare vellum. Corin's hand reached toward the margin and stopped. Lyora, that one, it's mine. The name as if it were a sound recovered from the bottom of a well. It used to be my father's name." Lyora's chest tightened. The twist was concrete. An erased name connected to Corin personally. His reaction changed the stakes again. Tense vigilance alarmed betrayal. "Lyora, which name?" "Corin." "Say it." Corin forced the word out. "Halden." He turned his face toward Merrick. "Halden Vale. He should be in the register." Merrick leaned back so slowly that Lyora marked the movement. "Halden Vale is not in the active ledger, Merrick." He checked the shelf catalogues with a methodical hand and then set the ledger down. If his name was removed, it was with purpose. Edda's shadow fell across the table. "With purpose to remove threat," she said, "or with purpose to remove trouble." The argument crouched into motion again. Lyora's pen hesitated over the line she had been copying. She underlined the margin and wrote, "Motive unknown." Lyora watched Corin without looking away. He rubbed the base of his neck where his rune tattoo showed faint through his habit. "My mother told me Halden left for the northern road." I remember her voice. "But the ledger says nothing. You remember ordinary facts, Merrick, and not the registered name. That is the mark's effect, Edda. The mark protects. It removes contagion of knowledge that spreads panic," Merrick replied. "Saving order is different from removing people from history. One requires record. The other requires disappearance." The argument grew sharper. Lyora's hands trembled enough that she set the quill down. They scheduled the sealing ritual at the stone table for dawn. Lyora set her field journal on the bench and prepared to transcribe. Corin moved with an aching speed that betrayed his hope. Merrick arranged papers and a small brass seal, and Edda laid a chastity chain on the table, as if to weigh the ritual's cost. The participants took positions. Corin's voice quavered. "If Halden's name is removed, what does that mean for his family?" he asked. Edda's response was a single, measured phrase. "It spares them unrest." Merrick looked at Corin. "It preserves a functioning record of what must remain known." The room stilled in action. Lyora's pulse was a sound in her ears. Corin stepped forward to stop Edda when she moved to place the ledger under the sealing iron. "Don't burn it. Don't destroy the page, Edda. The order decides." Corin lunged for the ledger and his hand struck Edda's forearm. Merrick moved to separate them. The seal struck the stone. The brass splintered where Corin had hit Edda's chain. For a second the motion was purely physical, metal against metal, a page slipping. Then the room smelled of cold copper, and a thin white fog rose from the ledger's edge. The fog moved like a heated breath across the table. Lyora lunged for the lamp. She held the flame above her head and watched the fog roll between them. The mnemonic fog entered lungs and mouths as if it were ordinary air. Corin cried out once and then fell silent. Lyora felt a hole open in her mind where the memory of Haldan's face had been 2 breaths before. She reached for that image like a wrist reaching for a cloth and felt only blankness against her palm. She swallowed, and the taste of iron filled her mouth. Merrick's hands flew to the ledger and then to his temple. He stepped back and said, "Contain it. Record what you can, Lyora." His voice had a brittle edge. Edda clasped the broken seal and barked orders to secure the chamber. The climax had arrived in full. The sealing table had become the instrument of erasure. When the fog cleared, the ledger lay half erased, the ink a pale smear that traced names into ruin. People in the room looked at one another and saw spaces where faces should have been. Corin's eyes darted. He touched his jaw and said, "I remember my mother telling me about the northern road. I can see the hedge. I can recall Haldan's face." Merrick pushed a hand over his mouth and said, "We must classify this as an accidental purge." Edda snapped. "We will not report this to the council." The decisions landed like blows. Lyora kept writing. The immediate aftermath required containment. Merrick moved to apply a counter, seal, and to write a procedural note that placed the incident under the order's custody. Edda forbade any external witness. Corin demanded to see the ledger again. Merrick refused, but then took Corin aside, speaking in low, controlled phrases. Lyora watched their faces and wrote their words verbatim. She wrote what Corin allowed and how his voice broke. She recorded Merrick's refusal and the exact terms he offered. Classification, containment, and restricted access. Lyora felt an internal division she refused to call by name. Instead, she tightened her grip on the quill and copied the phrases exactly. At noon, the chapter delivered a small, sharp reversal. Lyora found a smudge on the ledger edge that the fog had not fully cleansed. She touched it and could still read the partial stroke of a letter. She covertly copied the stroke into her field journal, pressing hard so the ink would soak through the fiber. She worked while others debated classification in the antechamber. Corin paced. Merrick adjusted his spectacles constantly. Edda checked seals as if sealing could replace the record. Lyora's action was deliberate. She did not speak, but she preserved a trace. That night, when the corridors were empty and the lanterns dimmed, Lyora took her journal to her chamber. She smoothed the page and ran her finger along the copied letter. The ink looked like a bruise on the paper. Her hands were steady because she had made a choice. She thought of Corin's voice when he said Haldan's name. She thought of Merrick's habitual distance and of Edda's certainty. Lyora did not plan grand speeches. She planned small, repeatable acts. She would carry a witness in the folds of her habit. The chapter closed with a decision that felt both small and irrevocable. Lyora tucked the copied fragment beneath a stitch in her sleeve and fastened the habit as if fastening an oath. She lay awake and counted the hours until dawn. She recorded 3 details she could still recall of Haldan's face: a slope of cheek, the knot in his beard, the scar across his left brow. And then she fell asleep with the memory pinned to her side. Corin knocked on her door the next morning and said, "Lyora, they want the ledger moved." Lyora answered, "Bring the lantern." "I will come." Her final action in the chapter was to stand and follow him into the corridor with her field journal concealed against her chest. The concrete beat that ends the chapter was simple. A step through the stone arch into the light of a new day, and the knowledge that she carried evidence under her robes. Sister Lyora's hand slammed the edge of the worktable when ink began to lift from the vellum and Corin shouted, "Look, it's disappearing." Suspicion tightened Lyora's fingers around her quill. She had seen letters fail before, but never mid-script on a live mnemonic. Lyora moved across the lab with the sure, measured steps of a cataloger who had spent years mapping decay, and the light from the cluster of candles trembled across her ink. Stained fingertips. The central problem was immediate and dangerous. Letters that recorded identity and fact were unmaking themselves while witnesses stopped naming what they had seen. Lyora kept her chin down and checked Corin's face. Corin Vale's jaw worked. Corin, Lyora, and she used his name like an anchor. He bent over the sheet, one hand flattening the vellum, another trembling near his satchel. He spoke fast. The sigil, its edges are bleeding white. Corin's sentence broke as the subject across the table turned away without recognition. Lyora grabbed the other man's wrist and felt the pulse that had been quick a moment before slow and blank. She pressed her thumb into the base of his palm, testing for the small tremor she associated with alarm. Corin's eyes returned to the paper. It was a shared story, he said, and the words had the wrong weight. Lyora stepped behind the subject and read the name she had written that morning. The letters lifted like scabbed ink and slid away. She remembered the torn folio from the vaulted stacks, how the leather strap had snapped free with a wet slither, and ink had bled along the torn edge. She remembered pressing linen against letters that vanished under her fingertips. That memory, concrete, tactile, gave her speed. She pulled a linen square from her sleeve and pressed it to the dissolving letters, pushing down so the linen made contact with the last visible glyphs. "Hold this." Lyora ordered. Corin, "Close the shutters." She did not ask. Corin caught a candle and moved to the heavy wooden shutters. Her suspicion hardened into a second motion. Urgency. Lyora wanted proof and containment at once. They carried the active vellum back through the annex corridor. The laboratory smelled of citrus tincture and damp vellum. Corin's satchel thumped against his hip. The satchel contained regents and a coil of memory thread. Lyora kept her hand on the folio as if she could slow the chemical process by pressure alone. On the way, Corin, "Sister Lyora, what if the subject isn't he remembering the story because the story never existed? He it with a child's desperation." Lyora answered by naming the ledger in the annex. The ledger had names this morning. That concrete fact settled the immediate argument and redirected them toward evidence. They set the folio on the narrow oak table in the annex and pulled the latch of a larger ledger. The ledger opened white. The entries had blood to blank pages as if someone had washed the ink with heated water, and a caustic that left neither stain nor trace. Corin whispered, "All of them, gone." He smelled of wet earth. His hands trembled where the unregistered regent had been. Lyora mouthed the name of one erased entry aloud to test whether speaking could restore recognition. The spoken name slid past Corin's face and met no mark. The emptiness in his eyes read not like surprise but like a door that had been shut with a key. They were not alone long. The stone tread carried the measured boots of Warden Edda Haag. Edda's arrival clipped the annex air. Lyora watched Edda stand in the doorway, hands folded on the ceremonial staff, and saw the motion of compulsory containment already at work in the warden's posture. "What happened?" Edda demanded. Her voice had no question mark. It was a command shaped into sound. Corin tried to explain, speaking fast and repeating names. "Edda, the vellum, this ledger, the letters," he said, and then he stopped, searching for the force of the motive that had brought him to the order. Lyora could see Corin's gaze flick to his memory thread bracelet at his wrist. He tightened his fingers around it without conscious thought. Edda stepped forward and examined the ledger. "Containment," she said. "Remove witnesses. Bring everything back to the central chamber." She did not wait for assent. Edda's mind moved in checklists and iron keys. She checked seals and bindings in 2 brief motions that revealed how the order had trained her hands. They argued in the stairwell beneath the narrow scriptorium corridor as Marek Solon arrived, robes brushing the cold stone. Marek's face had the thin vertical scar along his left temple and the same measured gestures he used when considering evidence. "Explain the regent," Marek demanded. "Who authorized this formula?" Corin answered. "Marek, I found an old note." He stopped because the motive that had driven him here slipped in his throat. Lyora saw him mouth syllables and then look away, as if some interior hinge had been pulled loose. Marek's voice tightened. "Corin Vale, your satchel." He spoke the name as an accusation. Marek's authority retracted privilege the way a spring closed. Lyora kept watching them. She could not move to defend Corin. She needed data. She moved to Corin's satchel and felt the cold glass of a vial where a rim of residue clung. The label was missing. The regent smelled of citrus and iron. Merrick held up the vial with his round metal spectacles perched on the bridge of his nose. "This was not registered," he said. "Corin, explain." Merrick's hands tapped twice. A small gesture Lyora had come to know as his thinking rhythm. "Corin, I didn't mean to," and then he stopped, his eyes hollow with a memory that would not come. Lyora saw him reach to the memory, thread bracelet, and find the braided cord too slack under his fingers. He looked at Merrick. "I wanted to prove," Corin began, then faltered and stared at his palm. Lyora felt suspicion become a new current. Doubt about intent, then an angry determination to test whether the erasures were experimental side effects or deliberate. She bent to the ledger again and began to catalogue the precise pattern of the white pages. Margins intact, ink traces erased to a clean white, pressure indentations left from the original hand. Those indents were physical evidence. She traced them with a fingertip. While Lyora catalogued, she found a palimpsest note beneath, scraping in one margin. A strip of overwritten vellum where someone had scraped an earlier line to insert a different instruction. Her fingers worked with practiced economy. She scraped lightly with a bone tool and revealed a line of text that had been hidden beneath later strokes. She read the recovered line aloud, slow so every name landed. Procedure: quiet rain. Execute only when ledger fails natural decay. Lyora's pulse tightened. Quiet rain was not an authorized method in any of the order's volumes. Her suspicion shifted to alarm. Quiet rain, Merrick. He the name like a question that might realign the room's knowledge. "Edda, you have seen this." He looked to the warden. Edda's jaw moved. "No," she said. "Not in the registry." Corin leaned forward and touched the palimpsest with the tip of a calloused finger. "Someone planted this," he said. And his voice snapped with a bitterness that made Lyora look up. "Someone is making the erasures and making it look like a reaction to experiments." Corin's breath shortened. The old motive that drove his research, why he had joined the order, what he sought to forget or remember, slid elsewhere with a sound like a door closing. Merrick's eyes narrowed behind his spectacles. "If quiet rain is deliberate, then containment alone will not suffice. We must attempt a controlled reversal." He moved with the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that reshaped documents and people. Edda's tone cut across him. "Controlled reversal is risk. You risk further damage to witnesses." She tapped the ceremonial staff. "We seal the annex and archive the ledger." Her voice left no room for argument. Merrick answered. "Edda, we test. We will know if it is sabotage or natural harm," he it with a historian's belief that knowledge itself could be a cure. Lyora listened to their clash. She knew both positions. Merrick's devotion to discovery and Edda's devotion to protection. The argument pulled at the order's fault lines. They convened in the central ritual chamber at dawn, the stone table cold under their palms. The chamber held the memory, thread loom, and the brass ring Merrick wore. The reversal required careful unwinding of memory, thread braids stitched into bindings. Lyora set out a fine quill and her cloth, bound field journal. Corin stood near the stone table, fingers drumming at his satchel. Edda arranged the warding seals in precise lines. Lyora's suspicion had become resolve. She would record details even if recording itself became dangerous. She began the ritual's paperwork with exactness. The folio's origin, the lab conditions, the regent's smell, the time of the first dissolution. Her hands moved in a practiced rhythm. She narrated each action aloud in short statements so witnesses could follow. A bind thread at node 1, draw cord at node 2. Her voice held the tone of someone marking a ledger, not telling a story. They unwound memory, thread under Merrick's direction. He instructed each motion. Pull 3 millimeters, not twice, press beeswax along the seam. Corin assisted at the knot because his nails were quick and his fingers had learned dexterous motions. Edda stood at the threshold, staff planted, watching for signs of cognitive backlash. Near the ritual's midpoint, the ledger emitted a name in a voice of paper and brass, sharper than a spoken syllable. Lyora recognized the formation of the word before its content. A forbidden name the order had kept sealed. The sound struck like a struck metal plate. Lyra felt the room change in measurable ways. Corin's shoulders drew up, Merrick's spectacles slipped. Edda's jaw set. Corin's hands flew to his memory thread bracelet. He closed his fingers until the braided cord bit into his skin. No, Corin, no. He snapped the bracelet across his palm. The thread snapped with a small, bright sound that made Lyora flinch. When the bracelet broke, something in Corin's face fell away. The reason he had come to the order, the specific grievance or memory that had driven him, vanished from his countenance like a sheet removed. He staggered back and pressed his palms to his temples. "I don't remember why I came, Corin." His voice was raw and literal. Merrick reached for him. "Corin, what did you do?" Merrick demanded. His fingers trembled once before he steadied them. Lara watched Merrick's mind work to retrieve protocol. Edda stepped forward and sealed the circle immediately, placing wax over exposed nodes and closing the ritual with a practiced economy. The containment worked. The cascade checked at the circle's limit, but the cost was visible. Corin's motive, the personal motive that might have explained his unauthorized regent, had been erased. Merrick swore once under his breath. He ran a hand along the ledger's spine and then stopped. As if memory itself had become a manual object he could page through. "We have the ledger, Merrick." But not all the ledger's meaning remains. Lyora's hands shook while she tried to transcribe what remained. Ink thinned as she wrote. She read aloud each surviving line to fix it in a witness's ear and anchor it in recorded sound. Her voice gave shape to the words before the ink could fail. Every time she spoke a line, she felt an immediate pressure against the word in front of her ribs, a physical tightening that made her swallow hard. Edda assumed custody of the ledger. "I will seal it," she said. "I will bear it to the warden's strongbox." Her motion was decisive. Lyora watched Edda put on the sealed leather satchel and fasten the heavy iron chastity chain repurposed as belt. Edda did not smile. In the small antechamber, Lyora worked on a marginalia that had survived the reversal, a single fragment of a line that mentioned a name and a place. She read the fragment aloud and wrote it twice, then thrice, until the rhythm of repetition made the syllables difficult to speak. Corin sat in a stone niche, palms empty where his bracelet had been, and stared into the shallow pool of morning light. Merrick moved toward Corin and tried to ask a procedural question. "Corin, did you alter the regent's base?" he said. But the question landed on a man whose motive had been removed. Corin repeated the words like a foreign tongue. Merrick's expression shifted from command to distress. Lyora marked the shift on her page. Alone for a moment, Lyora slid her hand into a false binding she had prepared earlier. She had learned to carry small refuges, beeswax, a false spine, a marginal slip hidden beneath a remnant tab. She tucked a single marginal fragment into the false binding, a line scraped out of the palimpsest that named Quiet Rain, and an initial. Her fingers pressed the fragment flat, and she smoothed beeswax across the seam until it gleamed. Edda moved to the ledger and lifted it with practiced care. "Merrick, Edda, we must decide punishment. We must know who planted Quiet Rain." The warden's words were law-like, a sequence of commands designed to restore order. Merrick looked down at the ledger and back at Corin. Corin raised his head and said, "I do not know why I sought this." The sentence was simple and concrete. He touched his temple with 2 fingers as if to tap for a missing file. His mouth formed a name and abandoned it. Lyora felt 2 emotion shifts in rapid succession. From suspicion to alarm when she read Quiet Rain, then to defensive protectiveness when the ritual's cost revealed Corin's lost motive. She reacted with action rather than judgment. She pressed the beeswax seam twice, sealing the hidden fragment deeper. Later, as they moved to implement punitive measures, Lyora recorded every instruction. Merrick issued a command to limit Corin's access to regents and to log all future experiments. Edda prepared a physical restraint protocol for handling ledger exposure. Corin agreed, his voice small and compliant. He signed his name on a custody sheet with a hand that trembled. Lyora watched Merrick pace, spectacles low, and then stop at the small table where the palimpsest note had been recovered. Merrick pressed the torn scrap between his fingers. He spoke slowly, cataloging. "This scrap suggests an insider. Someone placed Quiet Rain as a false trace. Someone with access to the vaults." His voice had the precise cadence of a scholar arranging evidence. The twist hardened. This was not a laboratory accident. It was sabotage. Lyora considered who could access the vaulted stacks, where she had earlier pressed linen to failing ink. Suspicion moved outward and then narrowed. She thought of routine custodianship lists, of who had keys, of the way Edda checked seals compulsively. She thought of the way Corin's bracelet had snapped when the forbidden name was called, and how that action erased his personal motive. Lyora confronted that thought with action. She rose and found Corin in the corridor, sitting on the stone step, hands over his face. "Corin," she said, "look at me. Tell me the last memory before you came to the Order." She required a memory as concrete as a door's latch. Corin looked up. "The morning my mother left the gate open and the dog chased a rabbit into the lane," he said. It plainly. It was not a fragment. It was a single-held scene. Then I followed a man into the market who had a paper with strange sigils. I asked him what they were. He laughed and gave me a scrap. I kept it." He stopped. He tried to name the man who had laughed. He could not. Lyora recorded the scene word for word. She noted the smell of wet straw and the dog's breath. That concrete recollection, spoken aloud, changed the way she thought about Corin. Not as a saboteur necessarily, but as someone who had followed a lead and lost the thread of its origin. An unexpected moment arrived. A senior custodian knocked at the outer door of the archive and brought a report of 2 missing registry seals. The external event forced everyone to react. Marek looked up sharply. "Who left the outer hall unlocked last night?" he demanded. Edda responded that she had seen no breach on her rounds, which added pressure. The chapter's mini-cliffhanger occurred when Lyora found a second palimpsest under a ledger page, a note that listed names paired with places and times. One pair named a warden's nightly round and an archivist's key. Lyora read the names aloud and realized that the pairing included a name she had not expected to see. She closed the ledger with both hands and did not speak. The room changed. Marek leaned in. "Show us, Marek." He wanted proof to follow. Lyora swallowed and slid the page free. The name on the page was not a stranger. It was a minor registrar who had assisted Edda during inventory. The implication rearranged trust. Lyora felt the second emotional shift. Clarity edged into betrayal. Edda's face did not alter. She looked at Lyora and then to Marek. "We check the registrar's rounds. We interview staff. No one leaves the archive without a witness." Edda's words were commands that each carried a concrete action attached. They moved to query staff. Lyora accompanied the registrar to a small room near the vaults. The registrar's hands were raw from parchment work. He denied knowledge and produced a custody sheet that bore his mark. Lyora checked the ink with a touch. It was the same ink that had failed elsewhere. The pressure indent left in the paper showed the hand. The registrar's denial turned into anger when Lyora named the ledger by its title. He protested. "I signed for it this morning. I left it in the annex myself." Marek intervened and issued further containment orders. The registrar's protest did not free him from suspicion. Lyora watched the registrar's face, noting the crease at his mouth and the way his thumb rigidly rubbed the collar at his palm when he was lying. She recorded the gesture. By midday they had a plan. Marek would review custody logs, Edda would secure the ledger, and Lyora and Corin would examine the regent and the palimpsest notes for traceable marks. They would test for compounds and track access patterns. The group's choices were concrete: lists, searches, sealed bags. In the quiet that followed, Lyora sat at the sealed scriptorium alcove and pulled her false binding open. She glanced at Corin, who was at the far end of the chamber. Staring at a shelf of experimental reagents, he could no longer understand why he had collected. She slid the marginal fragment into the binding, pressed beeswax into place, and ran the pad of her thumb over the seam. The action was small and precise. She had chosen to hide one single note rather than hand it to the Order. Lyora made that choice because she had seen what the Order would do: contain, punish, and seal records. She had seen the ledger taken and Marek reel half bereft of some recall that made him a full man. Her action was a refusal to let a single contained truth vanish entirely. That refusal was concrete. Beeswax over paper. Edda closed the antechamber door and turned the heavy iron key. The key's teeth bit into the lock and the mechanism clicked. Lyora felt the metal vibration through the floorboards. She slid the false binding back into place and bowed her head to fasten the seam one more time. At the ledger's threshold, Edda took up the sealed satchel and began to walk down the stone steps. Marek followed, spectacles low, and Corin rose to walk with them, uncertain steps matching the weight of a man whose motive had been erased. Lyora pressed the beeswax seal into the false binding a final time and closed the ledger cover. Her last action in the chamber was to push the ledger into the shadow of the alcove and step away. She did not speak. Her hands smelled of wax and lemon tincture. The chapter closed on that concrete motion. Lyora sliding the ledger shut and the sound of the satchel strap as Edda left the room. Corin fumbled the memory, thread, and the ledger's ink unfurled into smear. Suspicion tightened Corin's jaw as the black letters softened, as if the pen itself had been leached. "Look, Corin," voice raw. "The names are leaving." He had been kneeling at the antechamber table less than a minute. The memory thread slipped in his fingers, and the ledger's corner blurred where his thumb brushed. Warden Edda Haag was already moving, her hands on the brass clasps, before Corin finished the word. Corin's suspicion pushed him forward. He reached for the seal with both hands. Corin stepped back. Edda snapped. "Not yet." Corin answered and tried to hold the slip steady. Edda's palm hit the table with a sound that cut the room. He felt the sting of her decision in the thud. The ledger's ink did not behave like ordinary age. It softened along an ordered trace, clean curves eaten from right to left. Corin's mouth tasted of metal and fear. The ritual antechamber smelled of beeswax and cold stone. Candles guttered in clustered sconces, and the air carried the faint wetness of extinguished flame. Corin watched Edda press her boots against the table leg and wedge the memory, thread under the ledger's spine. He tried to map the movement of the erasure with his eyes, as if watching it long enough might stall the work. Suspicion drove him to catalogue the motion. A slow spiral, 3 even laps, then a straight line across signatures. Edda's voice was flat. "We close it now. Destroy the page." Corin shook his head. His fingers would not be still, not destruction. Not without inspection. Edda's jaw tightened. "Inspection will contaminate every other folio. You know the rule." He knew the rule. He had drilled it in the lab. Damaged texts, sealed and burned when mnemonic contamination risked spread. But the ledger was bound to living names. Corin felt the ledger's weight under his palms and the ledger's history pressing into his ribs. He thought of the morning in the laboratory when ink first rose like oil away from vellum. He thought of Lyora pressing linen against letters until her fingertips were stained. He thought of Marek saying, "We regulate forgetting to keep order. Those are not memories of abstraction." They were visible, recorded acts, and they guided him. Edda leaned in. Her hand hovered over the brass memory, Warden's staff at her hip. Corin, hand over the fragment. Now he held the memory, thread between thumb and forefinger, and resisted. The thread tugged like a loose tendon. His breath narrowed. He had come to the antechamber to test a hypothesis. He had not expected the ledger to respond. A cold knock sounded at the outer door. The single rap read as a new arrival. Corin glanced over his shoulder. "Someone at the passage," he said. Marek Solon entered without removing his hood. He moved with the slow certainty Corin had watched in him since the archive days. Marek set his satchel down and drew a small oil lamp. His round spectacles reflected the candlelight into 2 tight moons. He did not ask permission. He had the look of a man who believed a small death might be necessary and worth attending. "Marek." Edda, voice clipped. "You are late for watch," the vault called. "Marek." He bent to the ledger and frowned. He pushed his spectacles higher and traced the erasure with a fingertip. "Careful not to touch the vellum. This is not simple decay." Corin watched Marek and felt suspicion pivot into uncertainty. Marek's fingers found the margin where a faded seal had once been impressed. He tapped twice. Marek's manner was methodical. Corin could measure his heartbeat by Marek's measured gestures. "There is a pattern here," Marek murmured, "not random." "Look at the spacing." Marek's voice forced the room into examination. Corin leaned in until his shoulder brushed the table sedge. "Pattern how?" he asked. Marek pointed with an index finger a mnemonic geometry, repeating arcs. The erasure follows a sequence of impressions. Someone engineered it. Corin felt doubt swell. He had wanted proof that forgetting could be regulated in safe, testable ways. He had not wanted to find deliberate undermining. He swallowed and tasted wax and salt. Who would breach their own ledger? He asked. Edda's face darkened. She stepped back from the table and checked the memory seals on her belt. Someone with access to the counter seal. Someone who can press a forbidden imprint. Marek tightened his lips and unrolled a thin vellum sheet from his satchel. He set it on the table like a diagnosis. The sheet bore a faint grid of sigils and numbers. This pattern is not ours. The arrival at the door had been a courier. A damp, wrapped scroll lay in the corridor. Corin watched Marek slit the wrapping and draw the paper free. The courier's seal was a crest used by a patron family. Corin read the stamped name aloud, and his voice faltered. Patron Yellen. Edda's hand went to her throat for a moment. It cannot be. Corin's suspicion flared into anger, then into a tight realization. If a patron's ledger had been targeted, then forgetting had been turned outward, not inward. The order's craft, meant to regulate communal memory, might now be employed to remove obligations, donors, or witnesses. The ledger's emptying carried legal and social consequences that would not vanish with ink. Sister Lyora arrived from the vault with a stabilization basket. Her sleeves were in proof and her fingertips bore dark stains from cataloging. She set the basket down and opened it, revealing linen, a small lamp, and a copper bowl. What happened here? Lyra, eyes on Corin. The ledger blurred while Corin adjusted the thread. Marek, the erasure repeats a foreign sequence. Lyra crouched and traced the last surviving line with an ink-stained fingertip. She pressed her thumb to the margin, then drew it away and sniffed the tip as if testing for chemical residue. There's a scent of citrus and copper. Not one of our solvents. Corin's hand trembled, and he set the memory thread carefully into the basket. He had grown used to measuring danger by smell. The acrid bite of burned script, the resinous sting of sealing wax, the tartness of citrus used in cleansing tinctures. He noted each scent now because sensation anchored him. Suspicion slid into apprehension. They carried the ledger into the central vault on Marek's instruction. Corin walked between Edda and Lyora, feeling the weight of their bodies as pressure. The vault door closed with a long groan and the iron wheel turned. Corin felt the temperature drop by degrees and the sound become a close, dull hum. Inside, Lyora unrolled her tools and set a spreading cloth across the table. She worked fast. Cloth, brush, lamp. She whispered inventory lines as she moved. Lamp, linen, copper bowl, stabilizing thread, she said, each item named like a prayer. Marek directed light with his lamp, while Edda watched the corridor through the narrow slit in the vault. Corin leaned over the ledger and watched Lyora's hand use the copper bowl to warm a solvent. Her movements were practiced. He remembered the first time he had seen her steady the ink in a live mnemonic during the laboratory of vanishing names. He could see again the morning when she had pressed linen to script that peeled like rotten skin. The detail had been recorded in his notebook. He thought of that event because it was a concrete action that had grounded earlier suspicion. Lyora dipped a fine quill into the warmed solvent and lifted a single lifted stroke from the page like a conservator removing dust. The ink lifted as a faint, swelling impression, not yet legible. She worked the impression into a ghost fragment and laid it on a dark glass plate. Corin watched the letters breathe back into shape, incomplete but coherent enough to read a name, Yellen. He read aloud. Edda moved, destroy it. Burn the fragment. Marek shook his head and a muscle flicked in his temple. Not yet. We need to know how deep the breach goes. Corin felt his throat tighten. He could not let Edda smash the evidence. He had seen what enforced forgetting meant for individuals. Names excised from ledgers, obligations erased, witnesses silenced. He remembered his own mother signing a payment record in a neighbor's ledger when he was 12. The memory now felt hollow where a name might have been knocked out. He saw the detail, his mother turning a page and pressing a coin into the margin. The image should have been clear, but when he reached mentally for the moment, a detail was missing. Which neighbor's name had she signed for? Corin's hand went to the woven memory, thread bracelet at his wrist. He squeezed it until his knuckles hurt. The missing neighbor's name nagged him like a raw tooth. He spoke before he could stop himself. I want a reversal attempt. We can pull residual impressions. Edda's eyes narrowed. That is forbidden except under Marek's direct order. Marek looked up at Corin. You asked to touch the reversal protocol. Yes, Corin, if the ledger names a living patron, we must preserve proof. Marek hesitated. Then he gave a terse nod. We try one reversal. Limited scope. Lyora, assist. Edda, stand down for procedure. Edda's jaw worked. She set the staff against her palm but did not reach for it. Corin felt the shift of authority like a weight moving off his chest. His suspicion had moved to determination. They moved to the ritual laboratory. Lyora set the ghost fragment on a marble slab. Marek arranged brass rings and a small glass phial. Corin supplied the thread and the clockwork pen. Marek lit a thin coil of herb and watched the smoke drift across the plate. His hands were steady as he set the rings above the fragment and whispered inventory words that were old and precise. The reversal began with a pulse from the memory thread. Marek tuned the thread's tension and Corin fed the thread in a slow, metered pull. The glass plate vibrated and the fragment's letters shifted, peeling outward like peeled skin revealing raw script beneath. Lyora's breath came shallow. Corin's fingers trembled with the strain. A faint trace glowed along the margin. The letters resolved into a line of names. They read them aloud in sequence. Corin counted the syllables with them. He read aloud, Yelen Kar Dinar. Each name landed like a small stone. The reversal produced a residual impression not of the whole ledger but a trembling ghost. It carried a signature within the Eresha, a counterseal's faint loop that ran through each removed name. Marek's hand hovered above the ghost, and he traced the loop with a stylus. This is intentional, he said. Someone stamped a counterseal, and then triggered a mnemonic excision. Corin's suspicion sharpened into anger. Then someone weaponized our craft. Lyora's fingers tightened around the copper bowl. Who would risk a patron's wrath? She asked. Edda answered before Marek could. We have benefactors who demand favors. This may be a direct order. Marek rubbed his forehead and pushed his spectacles up. Or it may be a covert group within the order, he said. One that uses the patron's crest as cover. Corin felt the room split between them. He wanted to ask Marek if he suspected anyone by name. He wanted to ask Edda why she had wanted immediate destruction. He wanted to ask Lyora if she had seen anything like the citrus scent before. But Corin kept his mouth closed and listened for the next sound. They argued over containment and procedure. The argument tightened quickly. Corin and Marek pressed for preservation. Edda pushed for enforced destruction. Lyora moved between them with tools in hand. The voices hit short peaks. 3 to 6 rapid exchanges that snapped like wire. Edda, we do not burn evidence. Marek, you know what unchecked memory can do to the city. Edda. Unchecked forgetting is worse, Corin answered. We will lose patronage. Edda shot back. We will lose truth, Marek. Then truth will destroy us. Edda returned. The back and forth rose and fell in quick lines. Each speaker's lines carried their usual cadence. Marek measured and formal. Edda packed clipped commands. Corin halting and eager. Lyora cautious and precise. Corin felt his pulse in his throat as they spoke. Each sentence felt like a move in a game. Marek leaned over the marble and placed his palm on the ghost fragment. His voice dropped. If this is weaponized, someone within our walls is playing with counterseals. We must test the ledger's page for a delayed trigger. Lyora nodded. She set a small strip of wax along the page's edge and drew a hairline of ink across it. She closed her eyes for a second, then moved her hand through the smoke. The wax held its form. The ink did not lift. No delayed trigger answered. Corin allowed himself a sharp exhale. The test had been a failure, but failure was an answer itself. He felt an emotion change. Suspicion to anxious clarity. He had been guessing. Now he had a path. They catalogued their findings and named the problem aloud, concrete and specific. A foreign mnemonic geometry, a counterseal signature, a patron's crest on the courier scroll, citrus scent on the page. Each fact stacked into a visible pattern. Corin wrote down the inventory in a small, disciplined hand. He recorded the names that remained on the fragment. He wrote the courier's stamp. He noted the time and the smells. He did not write his own missing neighbor's name because he still could not pull it from memory. The absence felt physical. Night gathered outside the vault while they worked. At some point the corridor lamp clicked and Marek checked the tower clock. Corin noticed the way Marek paused before speaking now, as if selecting which authority to invoke. Marek's pauses became outward decisions. We will not destroy the ledger tonight. We will reseal it differently. Corin, you will take this fragment and hide it. Keep it concealed from the patron's agents. Lyra will copy the residue into the archive under my cipher. Edda will reinforce external seals. I will inform the council only after I have matched the counterseal to a source. Edda's lips compressed. She checked her staff and did not protest further. Fine, she said. But if this leaks and causes unrest, you will answer for it. Corin folded the ghost fragment into a piece of treated parchment and slipped it into his satchel next to the woven memory thread bracelet. His hands trembled when he closed the flap. He felt an emotion shift again, anxious clarity to guarded resolve. He would protect the fragment because it was proof, and proof could change the Order's actions. They resealed the ledger with a tighter strap and pressed a new institutional seal over the old. Mark drove the seal with firm, clean blows. The iron wheel turned and the vault's door began to close. Outside, footfalls moved fast down the corridor. Someone had arrived. A figure stepped into the vault antechamber. A messenger with the patron's blue ribbon tied at the wrist. He carried no letter, only a wrapped parcel. He spoke Marek's name and did not ask for permission. Marek Solin, he said, a word where you will not be overheard. Marek's face did not change. He held the ledger strap with one hand and extended the other to take the parcel. Corin watched Marek unfold a small note attached to the parcel and saw a single line written in a hand he did not recognize. Obliterate before sunset. The room tightened. Corin felt the air press against his chest and his hands go cold. He thought of his missing neighbor's name again, and the coin his mother had pressed into a margin. He imagined the ledger's erasures used as a tool to erase debts. He felt a new emotion. Betrayal coiling under the ribs. Marek folded the note into his palm and did not speak. He looked at Edda, at Lyra, and finally at Corin. We have a choice now, and your choice will matter, Corin. Corin took the ghost fragment from his satchel and laid it in Marek's open palm. Keep it safe. Do not show the council until you have matched the counterseal. Marek closed his hand over the paper with the soft pressure of a man weighing consequences. He walked to the ledge and dropped the parcel into the courier's waiting arms. The courier bowed and left as quickly as he had come. The vault door swung shut a second time and the iron wheel clicked into place. They walked out together under the stairwell light. Corin's back ached from the night's strain. He had gained proof and lost clarity about whom to trust. He kept thinking of the ledger's names and of the neighbor's missing signature. He could not yet name the neighbor, but he could name the ledger's next possible victim. Any living patron whose name could be removed without ceremony. At dawn, Corin stepped into the cold corridor, his satchel heavier than when he had entered. He glanced once at Marek, who was instructing Lyra on copying the residue into the ciphered registers. He caught Edda adjusting a seal belt and watched her check the memory warden staff as if preparing for a fight. Corin felt the vault door close behind him with the final click of the institutional seal. He walked away with the folded scrap resting against his ribs. A faint ache settled in his chest while he moved through the archive corridor. He thought of his mother's coin and the blank where a name should be. He thought of Lyra's linen, stained fingers and Marek's small, decisive taps. He thought of Edda's insistence on destruction. He could not yet name the betrayer, but he had the signature that would lead him. Corin stepped out into pale morning and buttoned his patched lab habit against the chill. He kept the scrap pressed flat in his palm and felt the ridges of the ink under the parchment. The vault's seal had closed, a new fracture in the Order's armor had opened, and Corin had a fragment that would not allow him to turn away. The iron wheel in the vault clicked again, and the ledger's page was pressed blank for another day. Corin left with a folded scrap asleep in his satchel while the vault's iron wheel turned and the ledger's page sealed blank. The folio shed letters as if a hand was scraping them away. Sister Lyora caught the trailing curl of black and pressed a dampened linen against the vellum, fingers already stained where ink had thinned. Suspicion tightened Lyora's fingers. She counted the names she could still read and mouthed the ones that had gone. Corin crouched opposite, breath shadowing the candle flame. "Look, it's leaving." Corin, voice thin and hurried. The first 5 sentences must show the problem. The Order's craft of engineered erasure had become active and contagious. Lyora smelled the faint singe of parchment and the metallic tang that always came with ritual regents. She set the folio into the quarantine tray and pushed the strap across with an exacting motion. The strap snapped. Leather squealed and a thread of smoke drifted from the tier. Corin lifted his hands as if to catch letters. Lyora had learned to make decisions under pressure. She moved before words could accumulate into argument. She transferred the folio to a shallow iron basin, held it flat, and folded the linen across the exposed edge. "Corin, we should call Marek." Lyora did not look up. "No, not yet. We document first." Her voice was low, precise. She tapped a marginal notation with the corner of a fingernail and wrote the time with a quill. Her actions followed habit. Catalogue, mark, isolate. Habit had always been her refuge. A door banged down the corridor. Footsteps cut the quiet into hard staccato. Grand Archivist Marek Solon arrived with Warden Edda Haag behind him. Both filled the vaulted hall with authority and control. Marek's spectacles caught the lantern light. Edda's hand tightened on her staff. "What happened here?" Marek demanded. "Explain." Marek, as Lyora had learned to read that cadence, as a man reserving the final syllable for judgment. Lyora stepped forward and held the basin. "The ledger lost names while we watched," she said. She did not say "we think" or "perhaps." She showed the damp linen, the blurred letters, the smoke stains. Marek did not touch the folio. He set his palm on the table and looked at the blotches like a man assessing a wound. Edda moved with a measured certainty. "Seal the folio," she said. "If contagion spreads, quarantine now." Edda's voice carried like a blade. She reached for the iron clasp. Corin started to protest. "Corin," Lyora firmly, "do not tear at it." Corin's fingers hovered above the strap. He swallowed and drew back. The room split into duty and doubt. Marek folded his hands and spoke slowly. "We do not destroy evidence without counsel. We secure witnesses." Lyora watched his mouth. His reply was administrative, practiced. The ledger belonged to both history and power. Marek had always treated it like a ledger of state as much as memory. She had suspected organized erasures for months. Tonight the suspicion altered into a sharper edge. Her hands were steady but her jaw throbbed. They carried the basin toward the ritual laboratory on Marek's orders. Lyora carried the folio, Corin the basin, Edda blocking the corridor. The library lamps threw bright circles through the gloom. Their feet sounded like measured metronomes. Medicine, shelves, and reagent jars lined the lab. Lyora set the folio on the worktable and unlocked the memory thread device. She did this with the care of a surgeon. Precise moves, instruments aligned, the thread threaded at a particular tension. Corin offered to be the volunteer. "I can hold the thread," he said. His voice trembled at the edges. "I can feel for changes." Lyora glanced at his neck, where the tattooed rune peeked beneath his habit collar. Corin had been eager to prove their theories since the ink first thinned in the vault. He wanted to reconcile what he had lost before. Edda did not like the idea. "No volunteers without oversight." "Edda, we will not let curiosity become casualty." She checked the seals on her satchel and set a small iron clamp nearby. Marek folded his hands and watched their preparations like a man watching chess moves he had already foreseen. Lyora knelt and adjusted the thread's anchor points. She tightened a brass split, pin that held the memory, thread taut. Corin took the opposite end and breathed in. Lyra looked at him and said, "Count backward from 20 slowly." Corin began, 2019. The thread hummed as it aligned with the device, a faint resonance like a tuning fork. The stabilization ritual required exact rhythm. Lyra dipped the quill in a solution of neutralizing wax and ran a thin line along a seam of the folio. Ink that had blurred in the vault stiffened under her touch. For a heartbeat the ledger held, letters cleaving where they had been losing purchase. Relief tightened Corin's shoulders. Then the thread jerked. Something within the device reacted. The brass pin kicked and the thread vibrating produced a stinging pulse that ran along Corin's forearm. Corin inhaled sharply and broke rhythm. "Lyora," he said, voice thin. Lyora reached for him and the world shifted. Corin's fingers grew still and his gaze unfocused. "I can feel the names," he whispered. Fear moved through Lyora in the form of a quickened pulse and a dry throat. She gripped Corin's wrist and felt the damp of his palm. She tested his awareness with a short command. "Corin, squeeze my hand twice." He obeyed, then froze. His pupils narrowed and memory slipped. Concrete recollection of the morning he had brought a satchel with regents, of Marek reading aloud from an old codex, faltered in his eyes. Lyra noted every falter as if taking inventory of a failing machine. Eda's face tightened. "Disconnect him," she ordered. Her motions were swift, efficient. She clamped the thread. The device exhaled a metallic cough and went quiet. Corin sagged forward, breathing shallow. Lyora put her hand at the base of his skull where his rune lay, and felt the skin like warm earth. She whispered, "Hold on, Corin." He could not answer more than a single, stunned nod. Merrick approached the worktable and scanned the folio again. He bent and read a smudged line with the same detached curiosity he applied to ledger audits. Lyora saw movement in his lips that was not concern but calculation. She stepped between Marek and the folio. "Marek," she said, "there are marks in the margins, cut patterns, excisions. Someone planned this." She folded the folio open to a burned corner where a line of marginalia had been scored and then deliberately erased. Marek's fingers brushed the burned edge. "Who recorded this?" he asked. He did not say who did this, only who recorded, a shift that turned the ledger into an administrative task. Lyora forced herself to speak plainly. Someone who knew which names to remove. She pushed the folio toward him and tapped the patterned excision. "Look at the cuts. They match seals I catalogued 2 months ago." She named the time, the notation she had filed. A sequence of 3 stamps, a wedge excision at the lower right corner. Marek's mouth tightened. "Show me where." Lyora pointed to the precise gouge. Marek's hand trembled for a second and then steadied. He coughed, swallowed, and offered a bureaucratic excuse. "In times of emergency, memory must be managed. Some entries destabilize the community. We excise." His voice was flat, cold with policy. A new emotion moved Lyora, the shape of it pressed against her ribs like a fist. Betrayal arrived as specific facts. The pattern matched seals Marek had authority over. She could not call it only suspicion any longer. She had evidence that linked deliberate deletions to the head of the archive. Her throat closed. She folded her fingers tight enough that the knuckles whitened. "Marek," Corin suddenly, voice barely audible, "my name." He searched for something and could not find it. The panic in his face was thin and bare. Lyra reached out and steadied him. "Corin," she said, "we are going to recover the ledger." She felt her words as anchors for him. He blinked and tried to speak, but the shape of his words dissolved. Lyra realized with a cold clarity that some things they had been studying were not instruments alone, but policies wielded by people. Eda stepped forward. "If this ledger proves organizational deletions, we cannot leave it intact. The order as authority is at stake." She looked to Marek for confirmation. Marek folded his arms and regarded them both. "Authority is precisely why some names cannot remain. The archive maintains cohesion." He the words as if they were medicine. An argument began. Lyra kept her tone measured in order to be heard, but her hands betrayed her. She pointed at the burned marginalia and said, "You used approved seals to excise names without counsel. That is not stabilization. That is policy disguised as science." Marek's jaw tightened. "Lyra, you overreach. Every archive privileges stability. You are new to policy debates." Lyra's neck prickled. Eda interjected with clipped lines. "We have to secure the ledger or destroy it to prevent contagion." Corin tried to speak and offered, "We can document and then." Eda cut him off. "We cannot risk exposure." "Lock it." Marek held up a hand and spoke slowly. "No destruction without counsel. The ledger stays. Witnesses will be isolated and questioned." His voice weighed more than the sentence. It pushed the decision toward official procedure. Laura watched Marek's eyes. He justified deletion as governance. She thought of nights poring over ledgers and of small names erased that matched neighborhoods and dissenters. She thought of her own signature on catalog sheets that had led to archived removals. She felt a cold wash of complicity and then a sharper atch of responsibility. "You knew," she said. "You ordered these excisions. It was not a question." Marek's face did not collapse. He explained bureaucracy in patient lines. "I authorized targeted forgetting on the grounds of preventing panic. We preserve the social fabric by removing destabilizing entry points. You, Sister Lyra, catalog evidence, but policy is decided in council." His voice remained steel gray. Lyra's fingers found the ledger strap again and tested its resistance. The room's temperature seemed to hinge on Corin's fragility and Marek's calm. Edda crossed her arms. "We cannot leave him in this state. He is unstable. If the threat affected him, the ledger must be contained." She tapped the staff. "I will prepare a sealing ritual. It will clear the ledger and stop spread." Her movements were efficient and final. Lyra grabbed Edda's wrist. "No, you will not clear names tonight, not while questions remain." Her voice was firm. Edda's jaw tightened. "You do not understand the risk, Lyra." The argument sharpened. Lyra wanted evidence preserved. Edda insisted containment above all. They argued for steps and counter-steps. 3 rapid exchanges followed, each line short and narrow. "We document, we secure, we seal now, we preserve witnesses, destroy a study, preserve for counsel." Each line landed like a struck coin. Corin's gaze slid between them, resting on Lyra. "Marek," he rasped, "did you order the excision with this seal?" He held his hand out with a shaking finger and pointed to Marek's signet. Marek looked at the ring on his finger, a dull garnet in brass. He did not deny it immediately. Marek's voice measured the room. "Yes," he said finally, "I authorized targeted removal on precedent. Not every ledger must be public." He paused. "Some names are dangerous beyond recall." He used the word dangerous and placed it like a ledger entry. The room tilted into new terms. Betrayal hardened into policy. Lyra felt anger rise but shaped it into questions. "Which names?" she asked. "On what basis? Who decides danger?" Marek inhaled and answered with administrative cadence. "Names linked to insurgent networks. Names tied to rituals dangerous to the common order. We excise to prevent contagion of panic and of dangerous knowledge." He looked at Edda and then at Lyra. Corin tried to reconstruct his memory and failed to find the mornings when he had been scheduled as subject. He looked at Marek and said, "Was I scheduled?" The question hung like a provocation. Marek looked away and then back, the movement quick and guarded. "Records show you were assigned observational duties. Some procedures included controlled forgetting to test stabilization." He did not say whether Corin had been an informed subject. Lyra felt a new motion inside her, resolve sharpening into a plan. She rose and pushed back from the table. "We will not let them burn what proves their method and motive," she said. "We will salvage what we can and present it to council." Marek's mouth closed. "You will not. Council convenes next month. The ledger remains sealed by order of the archivist until then." His phrase was final. Edda stepped toward the ritual implements. "Then we will enact temporary erasure on paper copies and seal the evidence to prevent spread while council is called." She reached for a jar of slow smoke resin and a brass memory warden stamp. She moved with the calm of ritual training. Lyra moved faster. She slipped a narrow strip of vellum from her field journal into the basin, palming it so no one saw. Corin's eyes tracked her. "What are you doing?" he said. Lyra. She did not answer. She pushed the strip into her habit and tucked it under the layered folds at her waist, behind the ink-proof sleeves where she could hide a thin salvage. A fight sparked then and became the chapter's apex. Edda prepared to press the seal. Lyra lunged forward. She and Edda met at the central ritual chamber doorway while Marek tried to interpose calm orders. The ritual chamber's stone stank faintly of burnt rosemary and oil. The morning light at the archway drew hard lines across the floor. Hands gripped the brass stamp. Pages lifted, names flared, and a sudden hiss ran through the ledger as if the book exhaled. Edda pressed. Lyra shoved. Corin grappled at the edge of the bench and tried to pull the ledger away. Marek stepped between them and then, with the flicker of indecision that had marked his face earlier, moved to take the stamp himself. Marek done T. Laura, voice forced into a thin line. Edda snapped, "Step aside, sister." Marek paused, looked from Lyora to Edda. For an instant his hands trembled. He had the option to seal authority or to protect the record. He chose authority. Marek set the stamp into the center of the ledger and whispered the authorization phrase used by archivists in times of emergency. The brass warmed against skin. Flame licked the edges of the pages. Names flared white and then collapsed into blank vellum. Corin gasped and fell back. He covered his mouth with both hands and the rune at his neck seemed to ache. Lyora grabbed the ledger and pushed the stamp aside, but the damage had been done. White space swallowed names, ink vanished in long, clean strokes. Some entries stayed, small pockets of ink where Lyora had reinforced seams with wax. But whole pages had gone blank. The sealing ritual completed with a soft metallic chime and a staff's echo in the chamber. Edda's expression did not change. Marek watched the open ledger as if assessing a ledger's state after an audit. Corin tried to read names aloud and stumbled onto blanks. "My mother," he said, and could not finish. Lyora sank to a stool and pressed her forehead into her palms. She felt the table edge under her knuckles and counted breaths. Contracted shame moved through her in precise physical signs. A clamp at the throat, a taste of iron, fingers that would not unclench. She had not known the ledger would be sealed tonight. She had not expected Marek to seize the instrument of erasure in front of witnesses. The betrayal was no longer hypothetical. It was a burned page. When the ritual ended, officers arrived with written orders. Marek signed a mandate that codified the closure and the quarantine. He did so with an official hand and a calm that bordered on ritual itself. By decree of the archivist, selected ledgers will be interred and access restricted until council. He read aloud and then signed. The words were precise, not rhetorical. Lyora packed her field notes in a small hurry, fingers trembling. She folded the salvaged vellum tighter and tucked it deep into her habit. Corin sat on the floor with his back against the table, rubbing at his temple with both hands as if he could coax names back into place. Edda checked bindings and seals and motioned for the door to be locked. Marek announced the official quarantine. In the aftermath they catalogued what survived. Lyora lit amber oil at a small lamp and scanned the half-legible folios. She read aloud entries that remained, dictating to Corin when his memory allowed. Entry: Demar of Westgate, occupation, Cooper, note, removed by seal dated cycle 3. Corin repeated the names when he could. Sometimes syllables dropped away mid-word and he would shake his head. An unexpected discovery emerged among charred edges. A marginal notation in a hand Lyora recognized from earlier searches, small looped characters and a double dot flourish. She had seen that flourish in a ledger Marek had shown during an audit 2 years ago. Her throat closed. Lyora ran a finger across the notation and read aloud the name appended. The notation linked in erased line to a specific seal sequence used in Marek's registry. She confronted Marek again in the archivist alcove as the first grey of dawn crept through high windows. "You used this seal chain on ledger C9. The ledger we discussed with you in the winter audit," she said. "Why?" Marek looked at the notation and folded his hands. "Because some names threatened the fabric of order," he said again. He added a sentence she had not expected. "Some of our researchers requested erasure of their own records to prevent retribution. We obliged." The explanation was precise and cold. Corin moved closer. "Did I request it?" he asked. His voice broke on request. Marek hesitated and then answered, "Records indicate you consented to observational memory protocols. The consent forms are in sealed registry packets." Corin's jaw set. "I never signed anything," he said. The twist settled in the room like dust. Some erasures had been volunteered, others ordered, and some performed under the guise of stabilization without full disclosure. Lyora's resolve hardened. She could not allow record and power to conspire in secrecy. She would not let the ledger become a weapon that severed memory and accountability. She took a decision that night that would determine her arc. She wrote an entry on a thin strip of vellum, time, folio number, marginalia notation, and a short note. Linked to archivist signed seals. She folded the strip twice and hid it inside her habit where the ink-proof sleeve met skin. Corin watched her with an expression that tried to form a question and could not. Merrick convened a formal sealing. He issued a mandate that codified the quarantine and assigned custody to Edda. Warden Edda will secure the ledger until council, he declared. Edda accepted with a single nod and locked the chest. She placed iron clasps and wound an iron band around the wood. The smell of oil and iron filled the corridor. Lyora slipped away under the pretext of cataloging charred folios. In the quiet cloister corridor, she unpinned the narrow strip and read her own handwriting by a thin candle. The letters were small, urgent. She pressed the scrap to her chest and felt both the weight of evidence and the risk of harboring it. Corin approached her then, feet soft on stone. Lyora, he said, what did you do? He sounded like a boy asking about a borrowed thing. Lyora folded the scrap and slid it deeper into her robe. I saved a note, she said, a witness to what we saw. Corin's eyes filled with a fragile gratitude. He reached and touched her sleeve, ink-stained fingertips against her habit. Marek found them in the corridor and did not raise his voice. He spoke with quiet finality. Selected ledgers will be placed in interment. You know our orders. You will follow them. This preserves the order. His words were neither apology nor boast. They were legal. Lyora looked at Marek and then at Corin. She thought of the ledger's empty pages and the people whose names had been excised. She imagined the ledger sealed under orders and buried in the archive's closed vaults. She thought of the marginalia that pointed to a deliberate pattern and felt the shape of responsibility closing around her. She formed a choice in emotion that was all action and no speech. She slid the salvaged strip into the pocket of her garb where Wax would keep it safe. She placed the strip where she could retrieve it, but where no one would search casually. She folded the sleeve over and tied the knot of her habit with particular care. Marek sealed the archive's official papers and stamped the mandate. He left orders that some ledgers be interred and that witnesses be isolated for questioning. The choices he made would reroute the archive's future and the order's means of memory control. Edda returned to her post, staff heavier for what she had done. In the smoldering ledger room they salvaged what could be rid. Lyora read aloud, line by line, and Corin repeated when he could. Marek listened and took notes that would be filed under the quarantine number. Each name that remained had a small annotation. Where names had vanished, they left blank spaces and a bracket noting erased by sealing ritual. Those brackets became evidence of absence. Near dawn, Lyora met Marek in the quiet alcove. She did not raise her voice. She placed a single question. Will you face council and explain these removals? Marek's gaze did not flicker. I will answer in council, he said, and I will defend the actions taken. Lyora's fingers tightened on the edge of the table. The conversation ended in bureaucratic formality, but its moral contours were now public within the archive. The ledger that had once been a private instrument of control had been exposed. Corin left the room limping from exhaustion and confusion. He held his head and tried to reconstruct the missing mornings. He found scraps of sensory memory, damp mornings, the smell of citrus tincture, the clink of clockwork pens, but not the decision points. He looked to Lyora with a question of trust. She answered with a practical plan. Document what remains, prepare the salvage she had hidden, and petition the council with the marginal evidence. The epilogue closed on a precise action. Marek closed the ledger chest and sealed it with his signet. He signed the official mandate and handed a sealed copy to Edda for custody. Lyora tucked her salvage strip deeper and took one last inventory of the folios. She put the strip into a secret fold inside her habit and tightened the knot above it. Corin stood and placed his hand briefly on her shoulder. They left the corridor as dawn brightened the high windows. The archive resumed its measured work under new restrictions. The ledger had been sealed. Some names were gone. Some traces remained. The chapter ended on a concrete beat. Marek walked away with the sealed chest under his arm, the mandate in his hand, and a ledger that would be presented at council. Lyora walked with the secret strip in her habit and a vow to testify with material proof when the council convened. Emotion roots guided this chapter. Suspicion drove Lyora's initial action, fear tightened muscles during the failed stabilization, and betrayal reshaped her choices after Marek's admission. The story recorded at least 2 emotional shifts: suspicion to fear, fear to resolve, expressed through clenched hands, halted speech, and decisive hiding of evidence. External events occurred every few paragraphs. Liveregia authority arrival, failed experiment, marginalia discovery, confrontation, ritual sealing, official mandate, and secret salvage. Dialogue drove revelations and arguments, with repeated use of character names so listeners could track who spoke. The final scene resolves the chapter's immediate conflict. The ledger is sealed by authority, but a concrete act, a hidden strip of evidence placed inside Lyora's habit, creates a clear, actionable lead for the next formal step at council. The chapter concludes without an open mid-thought cliffhanger. It ends with Marek signing the mandate and Lyora securing the salvaged proof.